Dr. King in a speech given at Stanford University, the other America. Several days later, King would go on to deliver one of the most consequential speeches ever delivered by any leader about foreign wars, and that was the war in Vietnam. We're talking with Bill Knox, Attorney Bill Knox here, analyzing Dr. King's speech all week this week. In fact, because Monday is MLK Day, I'm dedicating this entire program this week to looking at some of Dr. King's speeches and bringing it home and giving it local context in terms of where we are as a nation. The speech is called The Other America. It was given at Stanford University. Dr. King, in fact, in the intro in that speech, talks about flying to New York later to talk about the war in Vietnam at Riverside Church. What is interesting, though, is that The Other America is such a bill. It is such an important theme that fits into the context of where the city is, or perhaps I'll say it fits into the context of any urban city in America. I think if you go to New Orleans, if you go to Washington D.C., outside of the main center of political life, if you will, if you go to Atlanta, if you go to these other cities that have high concentration of blacks, we call them urban centers. This idea of the other America really fits those cities.
It does. I mean, you look at any one of those cities, whether it's Chicago or Cleveland or even Atlanta, even
right.
Cities in Texas to a certain extent. There's a core city that people see, and they see the shining city on the hill.
Right.
But they don't see what surrounds it, which are often the desolate areas that people live their daily lives of misery in.
No question. Dr. King talks about the gator of poverty, the gator of race, and the gator of misery. Let's do this. Let's go to Greg. Greg has a question or comment here.
Well, hey, it's a great show.
Thank you.
And I think that we are blessed to be able to have as many recordings of Dr. King as we do, considering he was probably the greatest orator in American history. And having those tapes helps us to better understand the power of language and the power of communication. And I think we as a people have lost sight of that in how we abbreviate language to the point that sometimes it's indecipherable what we're talking about.
Right.
And I think communication at its core is one of the keys to overcoming all the obstacles in this culture. Not the world, but this culture. And I think we probably should pay more attention to how we use language.
No question, Greg. I agree with you. As a student of literature, and I'm sure, Bill, you know this, the politics of language is always important because, look, Trump got elected partly, thanks, Greg. Trump got elected partly because of the politics of language.
Yes, he did. In fact, it's one of those things where it's actually he got elected because of the dumbing down of language.
Yes.
Because people...
And the infotainment movement.
And people would say that he actually said it like it was, when actually he was saying the only thing he could say because of his virtual illiteracy.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is when we look back to Dr. King's speech and we look at his method of communicating, he actually had a way of communicating that cut across the United States, so that not only could black folks who were born into and bred into the Baptist church could understand the rhythm, the cadence, the imagery, the color, the use of allegory, but that was also a language that could be understood by whites in the power structure.
Right.
And so the politics of language are still with us. And it's funny that today, last night at the championship football game between Alabama and Georgia, we had a president who was there, and ironically, he left just before Kendrick Lamar came on. And so it shows that there is a certain politics in language, even
right.
though Kendrick Lamar may not have been overtly political.
Unspoken language.
He was speaking in a way that this president and so many folks in the white community could not abide.
Right. Let's go back to the speech that we're talking about here. It was given at Stanford University in 1967. The other American, Dr. King, would move on to deliver another consequential speech, the war in Vietnam. Let's go to that speech again.
With the Selma movement in 1965, we were able to get a voting rights bill. And all of these things represented strides. But we must see that the struggle today is much more difficult. It's more difficult today because we are struggling now for genuine equality. And it's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee a livable income and a good, solid job. It's much easier to guarantee the right to vote than it is to guarantee the right to live in sanitary, decent housing conditions. It is much easier to integrate a public park than it is to make genuine quality integrated education a reality. And so today we are struggling for something which says we demand genuine equality. It's not merely a struggle against extremist behavior toward Negroes. And I'm convinced that many of the very people who supported us in the struggle in the South are not willing to go all the way now. I came to see this in a very difficult and painful way in Chicago over the last year where I've lived and worked. Some of the people who came quickly to march with us in Selma and Birmingham were active around Chicago. And I came to see that so many people who supported morally and even financially what we were doing in Birmingham and Selma were really outraged against the extremist behavior of Bull Connor and Jim Clark toward Negroes rather than believing in genuine equality for Negroes. And I think this is what we've got to see now, and this is what makes the struggle much more difficult. And so as a result of all of this, we see many problems existing today that are growing more difficult. It's something that is often overlooked, but Negroes generally live in worse slums today than 20 or 25 years ago. In the North, schools are more segregated today than they were in
Dr. King, again, here on a historical chronology. But Bill, do you get the sense that there's some sort in his voice and the way he's speaking, there's some sort of a resignation to fate?
Well, I think there was a bit of resignation because he had been so successful with the movement in places like Birmingham, in places like Selma, in places like even, Atlanta. But when he came to Chicago, he faced not only in places like Cicero the resentment of whites, but on the south side of Chicago, he faced the resentment of people of color who looked like him. So after a year of that, there was a certain resignation on his part. There was also the fact that this speech came 2 weeks after his speech on Vietnam on April 4th, 1967. And at that point, he had begun to see people like Whitney Young and others in the civil rights struggle turn on him because they felt that he was endangering their relationships and their organization's relationships with the Johnson administration. And so, in essence, their water would be cut off. And so they had already started to turn on him. So, yes, there was a sense of resignation. Even as you listen to him deliver this speech, there's a sense of almost sadness in the speech.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Whitney Young. Whitney Young was the head of the Auburn League, correct? Was it the Auburn League?
I can't remember which one.
I think Whitney Young was the head of the Urban League. If I could, let's see, Marcel, if you can pull it up for us quickly. Whitney Young was the head of the Urban League, I believe. And reading history, it's interesting you mentioned that in terms of just the leaders who were opposed to Dr. King. And which really says a lot, too, because I think Dr. King's vision was not shared by many. Even though decades later, these organizations will become the beneficiaries, the rightful recipients of the battles that Dr. King waged.
Well, there are a couple of things going on in this whole period of struggle that oftentimes are overlooked.
Right.
When Dr. King...
The ripple of Whitney Young, he was the head of the Urban League, right? That's right. Okay. Whitney Young was the executive director of the Urban League. Go ahead, Bill.
What people often overlook is how young Martin Luther King was.
Right.
And so in 1955, Martin Luther King might have been 26 years old, 25, 26.
Right.
And at the time he received the Nobel Peace Prize, he was the youngest male, well, at that time they were all male. He was the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Only recently with Malala, the young lady from Pakistan who was 19, only now has that been eclipsed. So there was this sense of, hey, young buck, just, stand back and you're making trouble. Let the old heads figure this out. You need to just kind of stand back. You're blocking the sun, which should be shining on us, the older folks of this movement. So that's one thing that was going on. There was the other aspect of there were certain folks who it was suspected were working with the FBI in their investigation of Martin Luther King. And so we don't know who they were. I don't know. I haven't researched it. But that's an issue that came into play because there were those who were willing to work with the government, which was trying at various points to undercut the movement because it worked for them. And so we see some of that today. And Dr. King knew what was going on then. He knew he was under observation by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. He knew that he was no longer, quote unquote, the fair-haired boy of President Johnson. He knew that people in the movement wanted to move him aside. He had seen the assassination of President Kennedy. He'd seen the assassination of Malcolm X. So when you hear this speech, you hear the resignation of the circumstances surrounding his life at that time.
We're speaking with Attorney Bill Noakes. Let's go back to that